It's always good to see you, Jeremy.
Good morning.
The yen, the dollar, Swiss franc, they're all down. So is risk returning? Are people starting to get that appetite back, or is it just, oh, it's a summer fling?
Well, it's cautious optimism, I think. That's the way to react to what we've seen over the course of the last couple of days. I think markets obviously had very high expectations into last Friday and Jackson Hole, and the fact that Bernanke didn't say anything initially to provide QE3 saw a little bit of a nervous reaction. But then I think markets realised that there wasn't a panic from the Fed, and I think that has encouraged markets to say, well, perhaps we've overdone the sell-off during the month of August, at least thus far.
It's going to be interesting because we get the Fed minutes from the August the 9th meeting later today. Now, if Bernanke is proved right that really there's no need to panic and that things will recover given time, is this the time that we should or might expect the dollars to start strengthening again?
Well, I think it's going to be interesting to see how the minutes are interpreted, because, of course, we have 3 dissenters, and I think that's relatively unprecedented, certainly in the last 20 years. So it'll be interesting to see a little bit more as to what the rationale for their dissent actually was. But I think also markets will be looking for the policy tools that were being discussed at that meeting very closely, because I think that's something which Bernanke didn't say, in effect. He didn't give us any real signs of what issues could be discussed by the Fed. So we want to have a little bit more detail about that. But if the economy is holding up quite well, and I think that should provide at least a degree of support for the dollar, particularly against the euro, because, of course, the problems that are structurally there.
Has the Swiss franc had its day in the sun?
Well, I think the S&B would certainly hope so. We saw the collapse in the Cough Business Sentiment Index last Friday. We'll see probably weaker GDP numbers on Thursday. So the S&B will be very hopeful that we're going to get back to 125. I think perhaps we have to be a little bit cautious at this point, because we've seen a big move already. I think unless we see a durable move up above 120, I think it's still the case that we're probably going to be anchored around the 115 level rather than going back to 125 and beyond.
And the other safe haven, the yen. How is that likely to perform over the next few days, few weeks, given that new leader in the country?
A new leader, but not necessarily a new policy.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we have to
key.
remember. That Mr. Noda, yes, he was in charge of economic policy. He's now overall control. Doesn't necessarily imply that he's going to change his stance. I think the key issue for the yen over time will be what's going to happen to capital flows from Japan. If we see that stronger risk environment, if we see strong growth being maintained in Asia in general, but particularly in places like Australia where there's a high yield, then we'll start to see those outflows, and that might encourage dollar yen to go back up. But I think for now it's probably still stuck in those overall ranges.
What about the euro? Very resilient around 145. You get the sense at the moment that everything happening in Europe is in some sort of holding pattern, waiting for the next big thing, maybe the next big crisis. What's your assessment there?
Yes, I think the month of September is going to be absolutely pivotal for the euro to see whether we are going to be able to maintain its momentum. We've got a number of political dynamics coming up. We've got a couple of Länder elections, including starting off this week in Germany. We've got the issues about the Constitutional Court in Germany, and also we have the ratification of the changes in the EFSF. If we don't get all of that passing by relatively easily, then I think the resilience of the euro, is going to be tested, and I think it's going to be a very interesting month ahead in terms of September.
And what about other currencies? What else interests you out there? What about Australia, for instance? Where are rates going? What's your sense there?
Well, I think everybody got a little bit carried away with the negativity during the last few weeks, and certainly in Australia and Canada in particular, in comparative markets, we saw markets moving to price rate cuts, and I think that was rather over-ambitious. I think in both cases the central banks are saying, well, we're worried about the inflationary pressures over time. We're worried about a relative lack of spare capacity. I think markets have become over-ambitious in pricing cuts. I think the reality is that if we don't see a double dip, which we don't think there will be, but if we see steady but slow growth into 2012, that as we get into next year, both of those central banks will be considering hiking rates rather than necessarily the cuts that have been priced in by markets over recent weeks.
OK, Jeremy Stretch, really good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed.